Hey, who's this? Oh, I'm Vermont Edition producer Andrea Lorian. I'm usually behind the scenes, but I'm here to tell you that the podcast you're about to listen to has been edited for clarity and brevity. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Romance fantasy novels, Romantasy, have taken the publishing world by storm. Authors like Rebecca Yarros and Sarah J. Maas dominate the bestseller list with their tales of mythical creatures, epic battles, and, yes, a lot of sex. But this genre has actually been around for decades, and it doesn't always get the critical respect that it deserves. Today on the show, we are talking Romantasy with local authors, book lovers, and sellers. If you are a Romantasy skeptic, keep listening. Our guests this hour are here to sell you on the seductive magic of this genre and break down some of the stigma around it, too. And if you're a fan, call in and tell us about your favorite titles or authors, or maybe there's another subgenre that you've been interested in recently. You can give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. We're joined first today by the author Catherine Arden, who lives in central Vermont. She's the best-selling author of 9 novels for kids and adults. She wrote the Small Spaces series, the Winter Night trilogy, and her most recent novel is The Warm Hands of Ghosts. Catherine, welcome to Vermont Edition.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
We are so glad to have you. I'd say we interview a number of prominent people on this show, but today the number of people in our office who came up to me asking, "Hey, is Catherine Arden going to be here in person? Do you think she could sign my book?" You blew Governor Scott out of the water. I'll tell you that.
Oh my gosh, that's wild to hear, and thank you. And I am humbled.
Let's define this genre that we're talking about today for folks who might not have heard of it. To you, what defines a Romantasy book?
I mean, I honestly think there is no official definition of Romantasy. I mean, you can say it's fantasy with romance, but I don't think every fantasy novel that contains a romantic plotline could be technically called Romantasy. But it's a publishing category, right? It's a way to help readers find books. And right now it's a very, very popular, big, dynamic publishing category. And so more and more books are published kind of into the category, looking for readers. But I think for me, a Romantasy is a novel set in a fantasy world where the romance is the main plot line. Like there can be there can be adventures, other plot lines, but the main kind of goal of the novel is to bring a couple together, would be my definition. But again, I think it might vary from person to person, frankly.
I also feel like romance novels are often defined by having a happy ending. Fantasy novels are not. Do you think that Romantasy novels often have that happy ending, that tying up with a bow that many romance novels do?
I mean, I genuinely think that Romantasy, for most people, falls under kind of the romance category rules, which means the happily ever after is a necessity. It can be spread over multiple books. You talked about Sarah J. Maas, whose series are long, and the romance might be drawn out. But I do think readers are expecting that happy ending.
Would you describe your books as Romantasy?
I would say probably not, just because I think that my books they do have romance, but the romance is a subplot versus a main plot. But then again, the category is evolving so much, and different people have different definitions. It's so hard to know. I think if you look at, for example, Goodreads, which has a new category for Romantasy, my books aren't shelved there. But I've seen my books described as Romantasy on lists. So it's almost like a, your mileage may vary kind of thing.
Do you, one of the things I want to talk about in today's show is the the benefits of being labeled as a romantasy writer versus maybe some of the setbacks. I mean, I think there still is some stigma around the genre, around romance writing in particular. Sometimes it's not taken seriously as a form of literature. And I wonder, when you see your titles shelved as romantasy, what does that signal to you?
I mean, the whole point of a category like Romantasy is to help readers find books they're going to enjoy,
Yeah.
right? And so when you hear Romantasy, you hear what the book might be about. It's going to have a romance, it's going to have a fantasy world, it's going to have certain genre expectations. And I think what you want is to have your books labeled accurately so it finds the right readers
Mm,
for the content of the book.
yeah.
I do think that the, people's attitudes toward romance aren't necessarily the problem of the romance community. Like, romance has been huge for a long, long time. So many readers love the genre. So many readers, embrace romance novels. There's wonderful work done in that space. Um, and it's a profitable genre in a world where publishing, is always looking to put out books that connect with readers. And I think, like, sort of the fact that uh, literary authors or the literary community is like, oh, romance, is maybe a them problem
Mm.
somewhat. Um, I think one huge purpose of novels is to connect with readers, and romance does that for many people. And I'm hugely glad that in this day and age, romance is something people are very happy to talk about reading and discuss titles and have sort of a community built around romance readerships. My grandmother, when I was a little girl, would hide her Harlequin paperbacks.
Hmm.
Um, and I know I'm glad that's not a thing anymore, frankly.
She was ashamed to be reading them?
She was a little like, it's not cool enough to be a big reader of romance. She wanted to be seen as like more serious, a serious reader, but she just loved, romance novels. And I think if that were today, she wouldn't feel the same kind of like, oh, I should also be a serious reader.
Mm.
Because I think people have begun taking romance more seriously.
Mm. Did you ever find those hidden romance novels and start reading them as a child?
I did. I was 14. As I think many 14-year-olds do. They creep around grandma's house and say, that's a cool cover, and you're lost. But
Well, today on the show, we're collecting book recommendations, particularly
uh-huh.
in this romantasy genre. And listeners, we'd love to hear from you. If you are a romantasy fan, call in and tell us about your favorite titles or books, or how you got into the genre in the first place. You could call in at 800-639-2211. You can also email Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. And a number of you already have, including one listener named Art, who writes, Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Liaden, or Liaden, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, universe novels and short stories have a strong Regency romance thread. A reader with a taste for romance with a sci-fi flavor might consider the following novels: Local Custom, Scout's Progress, and Conflict of Honors. The short story collection Bread Alone overflows with the stuff. And if any of the above ring a reader's bell, the rest of the series awaits. There's a lot to like in this universe, said he unabashedly, and enjoy your exploration. Art closes. Um, I'm glad that Art drew our attention to a series. You also write serialized novels,
I
and
do. I do.
I feel like there are a lot of these bestsellers, including the Sarah J. Maas books, the Rebecca Yarros books, which I mentioned at the top, are also part of big series. Have you noticed that becoming a more popular format in recent years?
I mean, I would say the classic romance series is a series where you start with one couple, and then the secondary characters from the first book become the main couple in the second book and third book and fourth book. You can take Bridgerton, right, where you have a set of siblings, and you just know that in every novel, a new sibling will have their love story. I think almost like the fantasy romantasy side, the innovation is that an author will stretch one romance over multiple novels, either by having the first book have a couple that's not what they call endgame, the couple that's going to be the final couple, or just having things come between them over the course of several books.
Hmm.
And it might be more of a fantasy genre trope to have a longer kind of timeline for a couple getting together. I do feel like in most sort of classical romance novels, one of the expectations is that the couple is together by the end of the novel.
Yeah. Well, your work incorporates a lot of fairy tales and myths. What draws you to fairy tales? Is that something that dates back to childhood as well?
I've always loved fairy tales. My first three novels were a series set in medieval Russia, in sort of the area of Muscovy, and they were based on Slavic folklore and fairy tales as well. Um, and I was a huge reader of fairy tales as a child. I devoured them. I loved ghost stories. I loved different kinds of folklore. And I was also a big reader of novels based on fairy tales. I was a huge Robin McKinley fan. Any kind of young fantasy reader from the 80s and 90s would recognize her name. She wrote retellings of Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast that were wonderful and groundbreaking. And when it came time for me to sort of brainstorm my own first novel, I was like, oh, wow, I love books based on fairy tales. I'd never read a book based on a Slavic fairy tale. Um, I lived in Russia for 2 years, kind of in my late teens, early 20s. And so I had a background and I was like, let's go.
Wow.
Also, for a new writer, having a fairy tale to fall back on means that if you're stuck for a plot point, you kind of read some fairy tales and think, huh. And it does help
Gives you a
for
bit of a
that.
template when you have that writer's block.
It just gives you ideas. I think, especially young writers, you're kind of staring at a blank page, just like this is supposed to be something. How does that work? And it's a little bit of a trial and error process for your first time.
Yeah. So you said you lived in Russia for a couple years in your late teens, early 20s. Is that where you kind of culled a lot of your research when you started writing the book from those past experiences, or did you start your research anew when you started writing anew?
I mean, so my earliest drafts took place in sort of this Slavic favored fantasy land. But I love history and always have, and I wanted to give my books a little more weight, a little more grounding. So I decided to set them in a historical time period. And I had read a ton of fairy tales, both in the original Russian and in translation. And I went back to them when I was first drafting, um, and reread a lot of fairy tales. I reread Pushkin, Afanasyev, who's a Russian folklorist. Um, and and then I went back to kind of history, and I knew I wanted to do a book set in a time period that felt very other. And I never read a book set in the 14th century in Eastern Europe. Usually, you see books sort of set in Tsarist Russia or Imperial Russia. And I was like, what if I go back to this time period that was very tumultuous, very interesting, and so far in the past and so kind of thinly documented that you can feel like folklore might be real.
Hmm.
And that was sort of where those ideas came from. I do love books based on folklore, especially historical novels. When you use folklore from the place the book is set, it feels very, very natural, very cohesive in a way that I love.
Is there another part of the world whose folklore you'd like to explore in a future work?
Well, I'm working on a book now set in Brittany, which is a region of France, and using Breton folklore, which is a wonderful mix of like Celtic and Arthurian and sort of romantic myths from different eras. And I've been loving the research and the writing for that book.
Oh, well, I'm sure your many fans, some of which were in our Vermont Public Building, will be excited to hear about a new project you're working on.
I love new projects. It's always a fun time to build that new world.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're discussing the romantasy genre and other subgenres of both romance and fantasy. They've been growing in recent years and attracting a lot of attention. We're collecting these recommendations. You can call in or email us. We just got an email from Anne in Tunbridge who writes, I recommend a new book by local authors Courtney and Clark Collins of Randolph, Vermont. Their book, In the Name of Honor, is fantasy with a side of romance, and it's a really engaging story. Uh, Catherine, I'm curious if you've heard of these authors since they're local as well.
That is not a book I've picked up, but I would like to. I obviously love taking book recommendations from people as well as giving them myself. I recently enjoyed The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst, a cozy romantasy.
Ooh.
If you're looking for even more sub-genres.
Well, how would you describe a cozy romantasy?
I feel like there's been a big rise in the last few years of lower stakes fantasy, as in the world is not ending.
Oh, thank God.
Um, and I think a good example of that kind of book is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. Um, there's The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. And then The Spell Shop, a wonderful novel, is kind of in this space of like, it's about a woman who goes back to her childhood home and opens a spell shop and makes raspberry jam and falls in love. And it's just peaceful. It's funny, it's charming, it's tender. I mean, the stakes are real, but the world's never ending. And I think that feels wonderfully cozy in this day and age.
Yes, the perfect escape. We're also joined now by Sierra Fales, a bookseller at Phoenix Books in Rutland. Sierra, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
We're very glad to have you as well. So tell us a little bit about the Romantasy offerings at Phoenix. Is this a big seller for you all?
Oh, man. Like, it really is. It's a phenomenon within in itself. We barely can keep things in. I mean, Onyx Storm, it was off the shelves so fast.
Really?
Yes. It's just I love this genre. I love to see what people come up with it. And I mean, with Onyx Storm, there's, you got the dragons, different types of dragons coming out, and we got some fun ones like the cozy fantasies that are coming out with that. And it's one of those genres that I love to see new things come out of.
So I grew up in the Harry Potter era, and
yes.
for those of my generation, you had to pre-order the next book in the series. Ideally, you got the really nice hardcover. Maybe you even managed to get a hardcover from the Great Britain edition that looked a little different. The physical book and how it looked mattered a lot, as did the words inside it. Do you feel like that's similar with Romantasy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, personally, I have to have my books match.
Oh, you're a color coordinator on your bookshelves?
Oh, that, and also like what kind of format. Like if I have a hardcover, I need the hardcover, and if I have a paperback, I need a paperback to match the series. I can't escape it, and I know that most of my customers also can't escape it too. I'm always willing to help them out with that.
Yeah. And Catherine, I'm curious about this from your perspective as an author as well. I mean, the Romantasy books and the genres kind of above them, romance and fantasy, both seem to be genres that sell a lot of hardcover books in a world where a lot of people are often reading on Kindles or on their phones right now. Have you noticed that trend with your own work? Do you get that information from your publisher?
I mean, we definitely do break our sales down by the format. I think it's been wonderful seeing the resurgence of paper book sales, and especially in the fantasy space. I do think that beautiful books attract the eye, and readers, especially the romantasy readers, I would say, um, they want to put their books on social media. They want to take beautiful pictures. They want to have a beautiful object on their shelves. And so I love that the beauty of books and the art of book binding and printing has become something that's important to people.
Yeah.
There's a whole cottage industry of rebinding favorite books. Like people learn to bookbind and they come in and they do special covers for themselves with embossing. And I do love the attention in this kind of digital age on books as physical objects.
Yes. And I'm sure, Sierra, as a bookseller yourself, that's part of Phoenix's business model. I'm sure you're very happy that people are interested in physical books too.
Oh, absolutely.
So, how do you all decide what books in this romantasy genre you are going to sell? Does that come from the publishing houses or recommendations that or requests you're getting from people who come into the store? How does that work?
So it's a bit of both, and also us booksellers, we're always so happy to like look at what's coming up, and we'll TBO it for ourselves too, for the shelves, just so we look at it, because like we want to check things out too. And so it's a bit of customers, a bit of publishers, a bit of emails that we get that from other booksellers, like, hey, did you see that this book is coming out? This looks really cool. Put it on your shelves. So it's a bit of a teamwork and a bit of, hey, you should get this book in. It looks really cool. And look at the spread edges. Like,
Well, we just got a question from a listener named Katie in St. Albans. I think this would be a good one for you, Sierra.
sure.
Katie writes, I just read Phantasma by Kaylee Smith and devoured it. Do the guests on today's show have any gothic romantasy recommendations for fans of spooky stuff? Sierra, do you have any
Ooh.
ideas?
So the one I just come up with, it is technically in the young adult section, and the time period is more contemporary, but not. I would say not quite Regency. It's called Belladonna by Adeline Grace. It's a trilogy. So the premise is this girl can see and speak to ghosts, but she can't die herself. And so when she goes close to death, she sees him, and then eventually it's like a murder mystery for all three books. And so it has a bit of gothic in it, and a little bit of magic, and supernatural beings, and there is a love story with it too. I read it recently, and I devoured those like so fast.
Oh, Katie, well, I hope you like that recommendation from Sierra Fales with Phoenix Books in Rutland. Catherine, do any books come to mind for you along the gothic romantasy genre? Fan of spookier stories?
I mean, a book I loved last year was Starling House by Alex Harrow, which is a Southern Gothic. It's set in Kentucky. And it's again got that haunted house with a dark secret, a mysterious proprietor, like a plucky young woman. All the pieces of the Gothic are there, but they're wonderfully remixed with a beautiful romance and an exploration of of small towns and how they can grow and how they can shrink and histories of darker periods in American history. And it's just a wonderful book on many levels, and I would hugely recommend. It's called Starling House by Alex Harrow.
Well, thank you, Katie, for writing in with that question. Catherine, earlier you were talking about cozy romantasy novels. We got an email from Jack in Essex Junction who recommends Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. They write, it's about an orc who's a former adventurer who decides she's going to open a coffee shop and the budding romance she has with an artist succubus. It's cozy and warm like a good cup of coffee on a winter's day. Very similar to how you described that genre as well.
I mean, I would back up that description wholeheartedly, and I think people in this day and age love a book where the world feels safe. The whole world feels kind and safe, and the problems are straightforward problems. I think that's a wonderfully appealing thing to people right now.
Sierra, would you agree? Do you find people coming into the bookstore asking for books that could provide a bit of escape or comfort?
Oh, absolutely. And that is Legends and Lattes, and also Tea Without Treason, or Treason Without Tea, one of the two. Excuse my mistake if I get the wrong. Those are two big examples of really cozy, very comforting books that I always go to when people ask me about that. Because, I do love me some Rebecca Yarros and Sarah J. Maas, but there's some days where I'm like, I don't want the high stakes. I don't want dragons trying to kill me. I want to look at a coffee, and I will say in a Legend Lattes, they describe a cinnamon roll and it feels like I was eating it for the first time. So I can't look at cinnamon roll again in the same light. It's beautiful written.
And our producer just looked up that book you were mentioning, Can't Spell Treason Without Tea by Rebecca Thorne.
Thank you.
Earlier, Catherine and I were talking about some of the skepticism that can come up around the romantasy genre. And Sierra, I'm curious if you've ever had an experience when a customer of yours was skeptical about a romantasy recommendation, but eventually came around to love it.
Yes, so that customer is now one of my many that seek me out personally.
Oh, really? So this happened?
Oh, yes. So I think about a year ago, she found me and was like, hey, I need a book. Can you give me any recommendations? I'm like, okay. So, and she was like willing to go into the fantasy, but she was like very skeptical. She's like, I don't know about this. And it happened to be Lori Forrest's Black Witch Chronicles that I was talking about at the time.
Oh, and Lori Forrest, a local author who we'll be having on in just a few moments.
Absolutely. And so I was like, no, you need, just try it. And if you're mad at me, I mean, if you don't like it, it's okay. Not every book is everybody's cup of tea, but just trust the process and just start reading. And she came back in, I think, maybe 2 days later to get the next one. And she looked at me and was like, Sierra, you got me hooked. And then now every time that she comes in, she'll be like a false, a playful, my bank account is not happy with you every time.
Well, it sounds like you made a great recommendation. And yes, we're very excited to talk to Lori in just a few moments here on Vermont Edition for this discussion of the romantasy genre. You can call in with your favorite romantasy books, or romance, or fantasy. It doesn't have to be a combination of the both, at 800-639-2211. You can also email us with your questions about the genre or those recommendations to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Catherine, we were just talking about skepticism here. I'm wondering if there are any folks in your life who you've talked to about either about your own work or about the romantasy genre who have had some skepticism about these genres and who you've had to kind of convince are, quite compelling works.
I mean, skepticism. I do think for a young aspiring writer, you just get skepticism full stop
Yeah.
because you're out there with a straight face saying, "I'm gonna make things up for a living." And people say, "Uh-huh. Don't quit your day job." Of course, that's kind of a natural reaction. I think obviously that was, a few years ago for me now, and that kind of skepticism doesn't come my way, but I think what you see now is people saying, like, "I love fantasy, but I also love serious books, don't worry."
Hmm.
And I think this idea that a fantasy or romantasy can't pack real weight, thematically or artistically is something that's on its way out, but should definitely go. I think there's fantasy novels that tell us interesting and amazing things about our own worlds or explore depths of the way we live. That's almost harder to do in a fully realistic novel, because fantasy can embody things that aren't real. Um, I'm a big horror fan, and horror is a genre that does this particularly well.
Yes. Well, with romance and romantasy, a majority of the best-selling authors are women. I wonder if you think that there's some baked-in misogyny to the skepticism of this work.
I mean, possibly. I think, there was an era when certain books were called women's fiction, but there wasn't really a similar category that was men's fiction. The idea being that there was general fiction for everyone, but then fiction for only women, which isn't sort of a categorization that I think has moved on. There is sort of a knee-jerk reaction these days to auto-categorize women writing fantasy as romantasy, which is maybe not true. For some writers, they're writing fantasy without romance. There was a similar knee-jerk reaction 10 years ago, categorizing every woman fantasy writer as a YA writer, as a young adult writer,
Huh.
whether or not her book had sort of mature themes or not. And it's hard to know. I think part of it is just when the biggest names in fantasy right now are writing romantasy and they're women, you just kind of your brain auto categorizes that.
Yeah.
And is there misogyny? I don't know. It's so hard to sit there and say, here's why something is. And certainly, you know, if you're talking about the biggest category in publishing right now with authors who are becoming household names, like making wonderful careers for themselves, so it's hard to be offended by this approach.
Yeah.
But it's hard to know.
Hmm. Well, we do have to pause for one more short break and let Sierra Fales of Phoenix Books in Rutland get back to her work. Sierra, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored, and I'm so glad to you, Catherine, that I wasn't the only folklore and mythology nerd.
It was definitely all of us. Definitely all of us at a certain age. I think there's a pipeline between like the folklore kids to the YA fantasy kids to the romantasy adults. I think that's a real progression.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sierra Fales with Phoenix Books. Thank you again. We are also joined now by Lori Forrest of East Calais. She's the best-selling author of 8 books, including The Black Witch Chronicles. Lori, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about just broadly, your thoughts on romantasy and this boom that seems to be happening right now. Is it exciting for you to watch unfold?
Oh, super exciting because my books are romantasy. But also, there's so many fun books out there. I heard you guys mention some favorites of mine.
What have been your experiences as part of the Vermont literary community? Do you feel like there are other romantasy authors out there in our region who you connect with over this work?
Well, it seemed like when I first got involved in the Vermont literary community, the majority of people were writing literary fiction. So it's been exciting to start getting to know other fantasy authors. And there's a lot of them out there, I'm finding.
Well, let's go to the phones. We have Elisa calling in from Brattleboro with a recommendation. Elisa, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Right after I read The Bear and the Nightingale, which I loved as someone with a graduate degree in folklore and a great lifelong lover of fairy tales, I read Catherine M. Valente's Deathless, which is a retelling of the story of Koschei the Deathless, and it's incredible. The writing is beautiful, and they pair really well together. It's got a little bit of everything you're talking about: horror, fantasy, romance, and folklore.
Wow, thank you, Elisa. Deathless by Catherine M. Valente. All right, we're talking Russian folklore, so that one goes right to you, Catherine. Have you heard of this book?
I have read it many times. It's a fantastic novel, absolutely amazing. It takes place in the 20th century during the Russian Civil War and World War II, and it's a wonderful, incredibly written mix of history and fantasy, and there is romance. But it's an absolutely wonderful novel, and I recommend to all the listeners.
Well, thank you for the recommendation. Lori, are there any books on your bookshelves that you just powered through recently that you'd like to recommend?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you want a cozy fantasy, Spell Shop is so much fun. And there is a sentient spider plant sidekick, which is just so cute. If you want romance fantasy that's a little more literary in quality, Radiance by Grace Draven is amazingly well written. It's the #1 recommended book by my readers, so I finally broke down and read it, and I was so happy to read that. And then Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies is absolutely stellar. It's an academic and a fae lord. It's absolutely incredible and beautifully written.
You get book recommendations from your readers, you said. Catherine, do you as well?
I do occasionally. I just feel like as a writer, you're sometimes inundated with book recommendations. You have books written by your friends, you have books your friends recommend, you have books you're hoping to read and blurb or talk about, and it just becomes a little overwhelming tracking who recommended what when sometimes. And of course,
I get a lot of podcast recommendations. If it's
yes,
comparable.
oh my gosh, and of course, like the to be read list and the stack just is taller than you. So I feel like I'm always like I have an ongoing list in my phone of like books recommended, books read, and it's just It's so long.
Yeah.
It is so long.
Well, to add to that, we got a couple recommendations on Instagram when we put a call out for your favorite romantasy novels. One person wrote, of course, about Onyx Storm, the newest book by Rebecca Yarros. Another person told us about Manacled by Sen-Lin Yu. It's Harry Potter fan fiction. And a third person wrote in about The Black Witch by our guest, Lori Forrest. Well, since I was just talking about Instagram, let's talk about Bookstagram and Book Talk. I feel like these online communities on social media have been a big gathering place for fans of romantasy. Lori, are you part of either Bookstagram or Book Talk?
I'm on Instagram, but I'm terrible with social media. My books are about dryads, and I spend a lot of time in the woods. So I'm not even on TikTok. I shouldn't admit that, but I'm not really on it.
That's okay. It's okay. But I assume you have heard about the proliferance of these online communities.
Oh yeah, I'm on Instagram. I really enjoy Instagram because I love authors posting, their new book covers and just the graphics of the whole thing. And I think Catherine was talking earlier about the beauty of book covers. I really like following that, and also seeing the different covers that authors have in different countries for the same book.
Mm. Catherine, do you feel like these platforms are important for publishing?
I mean, these platforms are vastly important because it's readers that really sell books. Like all the online advertising, all of the publisher work in the world is helpful. But I think what really sells books and makes them successful is readers telling readers which books they loved. And a wonderful way for readers to reach each other is social media. And so Bookstagram and Book Talk are ways for books to connect with people who might read them and love them. And honestly, I think people on those platforms trust fellow readers the most for recommendations because obviously an author has an interest in recommending their own book. But your friend is going to be honest, like, hey, I love this book for reals, you should read it. And no one's more persistent than your friend who loved a book and wants you to read it. They are aggressive. They text you. They go, "What did you think?" every 5 minutes. And I think that's wonderful. And it's so great these platforms exist because that's how books get out there. Not the only way, but it is a wonderful way for books to get out there and find audiences.
Mm. Lori, earlier Catherine and I talked a bit about some of the stigma that can surround the romantasy genre, and I'm curious if that's ever come up with your own work. If there's ever been anybody in your life, either on the publishing side or family or friend, who has said something dismissive about the genre that you've had to talk to them about.
Well, I do think growing up, I pretty much just read nonfiction and classics, and there definitely was this feeling that romance was, I don't know, kind of the tabloid newspaper type of literature. And I'm so happy that I don't have any prejudices about that anymore because it's such great fun, and also some of it's incredibly well written. And I've gotten to the point where I feel like, romance is such a pivotal part of most people's lives. I mean, every person existing on the earth, most of those people are here because somebody fell in love and they had a baby. And so this is a central experience for people. So I don't understand why romance wouldn't be something taken seriously as a topic for a book.
I love that. That's a great way to think about it. Yes, it's so much a part of all of our lives. And Lori, you also mentioned that you do a lot of research in the woods. Can you tell us a little bit about how you get your ideas for your books, how you do that research?
Oh yeah, well, I like for example, there's I needed to find a way to connect these fire fae in my story with the woods, and of course the woods are at first afraid of these fire fae, but the fire fae do bond with a certain type of forest eventually in the story because they actually need fire for their pine cones to germinate, and that's based on a real thing. And so I tried to take really strange tree facts and kind of amp them up in a fantasy way and put them in fantasy, which is a lot of fun.
I love that you can use Vermont and your surrounding environment to inform your work. Catherine,
Well, I have
go ahead.
a lot of Vermont in the book, but in some ways it had to be fixed because when my editor went through my story, the first draft, she was like, "Laura, you've got foliage season happening 3 times in this story, and then winter coming. You have to pick one place for foliage season. That's it."
I thought it was a fantasy world. You could do whatever you want.
That's right. Should have said that.
Catherine, does Vermont make its way into your work in any noticeable ways?
I mean, so I've written fantasy novels for adults, but I've also written a quartet of scary stories for children, and all 4 of them are set in contemporary Vermont. So certainly in those books and in that work, I've been hugely influenced and inspired by the state and the environment we live in. So yes, although my fantasy work takes me further afield, my books for children so far have all been set in the Green Mountain State.
And for our younger listeners who might dream of having a literary career like both of you do you have any advice for them, particularly for somebody who's as of yet unpublished, doesn't have an agent or a publishing house, and is just starting to dream about being a writer? Lori, we'll start with you.
Well, I recently spoke at a local high school, and it was exciting to meet all these young writers. And I think that I'm a good example of someone that doesn't have a background in writing. I have a math and science background. So I think that anyone, if they really want to, can write a book. And don't compare your writing to the books you see in the library, because when you look at a professionally done book, that's been through multiple edits with high-end editors who take that book and really refine it into something very, very wonderfully readable. So, do a lot of reading, do a lot of writing, and know that you can be an author if you want to be it.
And who's your most trusted reader or editor?
Well, I have a writing group of, my main writing group is just 3 of us, and we've been together for many years, and we submit a chapter every week. So that's been wonderful.
Keeps you honest.
Yes.
Catherine, what about you? Any advice for the young writers out there?
Absolutely. My go-to advice is finish what you start. It is easy to be inspired to write a story. It's easy to start your story, but every story comes to a point where you have to put in effort, do work. It's hard. Maybe it's not going well. Maybe it feels impossible. Maybe you have a shiny new idea you want to pursue. But you learn so much more by finishing than you do just by starting. My metaphor is always juggling. Like, anybody can throw 6 apples into the air, but can you catch all 6? I couldn't. And it's the same thing with writing. You have to learn how to finish. And that can only be learned by finishing. And so get through your drafts. Don't abandon your drafts is my biggest piece of writing advice for any aspiring writer.
And then do you have a most trusted reader or editor on your team or in your community?
I mean, my editor at Random House has been with me since my first book and is a genius, actually, and reads all my stuff and has given me pages and pages and pages of just wonderful notes, advice, help over the years. My favorite kind of non-professional reader is a dear author friend of mine named Naomi Novik, who also writes fantasy, and she's a fantastic reader and a fantastic writer. And she reads my stuff and comes back with fabulous advice every single time. And I have been hugely grateful to her for her eye for years. And I hope, it's great.
We just got another recommendation from a listener, a book called Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. I should also note that we're going to be collecting all of these recommendations that we've heard throughout this hour, and we'll include them in the show notes for today's show on vermontpublic.org. All right, one last question for both of you, a question I love to ask writers because I'm nosy. Where's your favorite place to write? Can you describe it for us? Catherine, we'll start with you.
I used to be a coffee shop girl. I would go to the local coffee shop and sit with a latte and do work. But I have very much become a office writer. So I have I have an office with wall-to-wall bookshelves. I have a standing desk. It has like a little walking pad. I have my teapot in the kitchen just next door, and I write almost exclusively in my office, unless it's a cold day, in which case I stay close to the wood stove. I think many Vermonters understand.
You're gonna, with that setup, you're gonna write a cozy romantasy without even knowing it.
One day it's gonna happen.
And Lori, where do you write?
Well, I live out in the Vermont wilderness, so 4 a.m., wood stove going.
4 a.m.
And candle, 4 a.m. Candle, well, it's just a magic hour. It's a magic time in early morning. And out in the Vermont woods with the wood stove and some candles, it is just, there's something about Vermont and there's something about the Vermont woods that is pure magic.
Wow. Okay, so two votes for the wood stove. This is telling me something about how to become a writer. And then
you don't have to write at 4 a.m. It's not necessary.
Oh, it's a good time to write. Try it. It's good.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah, Lori, I think you and I might have some differences in opinion on that one as well.
Yeah.
And then lastly, a quick shout out. I know you two have been part of this Vermont literary community that we love to celebrate here on Vermont Edition for many years. Is there a local bookstore that each of you love that you'd like to give a little love to in this world of Amazon that we live in, Lori?
Oh, well, Bear Pond Books and Phoenix Books, they have been so crazy supportive, and they're just so supportive of authors. There's so many great Vermont indies.
And Catherine?
Oh, yes. I'd back both those Bear Pond Books and Phoenix Books, but also my local, which is Bridgeside Books in Waterbury, a gorgeous small bookstore with a cafe next door, just waiting for you to find your next favorite read.
Catherine Arden is a best-selling author. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today from Central Vermont.
Thank you so much for having me.
And yet another best-selling author, Lori Forrest of East Calais. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating hearing about you and your work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, if you have any lingering romantasy recommendations that you'd like to share with us, again, we're going to compile all of these into a big reading list for you all on our website, vermontpublic.org. You can email us with your favorite titles or authors to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. That is all the time that we have for today's show. It was directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Anna Berg is our intern, and our call screener today was Rick Barrett. Our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening. Happy reading, and we'll catch up again soon.